Welcome to another episode of A Gift from Adversity. My name is Juri Love. I'm your host. Thank you so much for tuning in today. And I'm very excited to have another guest for the show. Before I introduce my guest, I want to introduce my book, which is A Gift from Adversity. And this book that I wrote came out in 2020. The subtitle is Overcoming Sexual Abuse, Domestic Violence, Bullying, and Homelessness. It is available on Amazon. So, before I introduce my guest, I just wanted to tell our audience that after overcoming these adversities and publishing my book, a lot of people contacted me and told me about their adversity. And I felt compelled to create a platform where people can share their adversities without a stigma and tools that they use to overcome and a gift that came from it. So far, I have introduced many guests from all over the world, and today is not an exception. Today, we have a guest from Denmark, all the way from Europe, and I'm very grateful to have Trine Hansen. Hi,
Hi,
Trine.
hi, Juri. Thank you so much for having me. It's such important work you're doing, helping people not to feel alone in adversity and show that we can actually find gifts.
Thank you very much, Trine. So, can you tell our audience your name and then what you do?
Yes, I'm Trine and I'm from Denmark. And you said my name very well. It's tricky for most people. So that is just fine. I am a coach, an author, and a podcaster, and my specialty is happiness because I believe that when we find a foundation of being happy and aligned with our souls and ourselves, that gives us the strength where we can create a life we love waking up to every day.
Thank you. And then what is your website and social media that people can follow?
Mhm. I'm on Facebook. That's just Trine Lehmann Hansen, or I have a page called Happy and Aligned, and then my website where there's links to everything really. That is www.trinesplayground.com. I believe that life's meant to be a playground and not an obstacle course. So that's why I created my own little corner, my own little playground on the internet.
So it's trinesplayground.com.
Yes.
So people can visit and then people can find her on Facebook as well. Trine Lehmann Hansen.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that. So Trine, where are you in Denmark? I have no idea the geography of Denmark.
No, Denmark is just a teeny tiny part that sticks out on top of Germany. So we are easy to miss. We are a tiny country. We are barely 6 million people. And I'm in a small town called Jelling, spelled with a J. And it's actually a historical place. We have a lot of Viking heritage here. So
Wow, interesting. And what kind of culture do you guys have in Denmark? I have never met somebody from Denmark.
Oh, oh, that's a good question because it's difficult to say sometimes when you look at things from the inside, I guess. But we are known to have a society that is very equal. We are very fortunate. We have, social security and the social safety net, and then we're known for our very changeable weather, and that some people find us a little bit cold actually because we're not super good at eye contact, and we're not we we need to know people a little bit before opening up typically. I think that those are some of the things people like about Denmark, but that it's still nice and friendly, but just not, we don't go around hugging everybody or kissing on the cheeks Southern European countries.
Well, that's interesting. And I know bakery is great too, no?
Bakeries?
Yes.
Yeah, pastries. I think we're known for, and bacon. We're famous for our bacon in some parts of the world.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Mm.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. It's very intriguing to meet somebody from a different country. I'm from Japan originally, but I'm living in America. I would say Japanese culture is very, very, very thick, and then thousands of years history. And then I think
Mm.
it's very interesting to live in America as a Japanese person, and it's been a lot of cultural differences and barriers that I've experienced. But I really think all this culture thing makes our life interesting every day.
Yes, I can only imagine. I have limited experience with either culture, American or Japanese, but they seem quite different to me. And it makes sense that culture is of interest to you, whereas I'm just living in my own culture. So I only meet them like on the internet. And when I talk to people from around the world, I really enjoy that. I'm so grateful for technology that I can sit at home and meet people from everywhere.
Yes, absolutely. And what kind of coaching do you do?
That's a good question because I actually try to do things a little bit differently because there is a lot of mainstream coaching that I find to be a little too much like just do it mentality and let's find all your flaws and your weaknesses and then improve them. I like to focus on what's already working. So instead of a coaching session, I call it a spotlight session where we put a spotlight on what are the strengths, and then even just like you find gifts in adversity, I look for them in all our flaws and shortcomings. I usually say that we can turn our shortcomings into superpowers. So I like doing it that way instead of improving things or changing them. I like sort of keeping them and just changing the perspective and turning them into something that works for us.
That's very different approach.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's what I needed to to find my way, and I find that it resonates with people, even though it's not the most common way to look at things. But when you get into it, it's people actually like not having to constantly change and be better, and this whole idea of becoming that better version of ourselves. What if we are actually enough just as we are? I like that thought.
Yes, I like that too. So let's dive into our first question, which is
Mhm.
adversity. So can you tell our audience what was your adversity?
Oh, Juri, compared to your story, my story seems it doesn't seem that hard because on the surface my life looked okay all the way through. What I was struggling with was stress and depression. So that was more of internal adversity, you can say. I was my own worst enemy for a very long time.
And how long did it last?
Well, when the worst part of it was more than a decade, but around 10 years. But even before then, even as I grew up, I always had this sense that life was kind of unfair because it seemed so easy for some. They were just succeeding in everything they did and doing well at school and sports and everything. For instance, like my brother, who's a superstar at everything he does. And I was always struggling. I was shy and I was awkward and things felt difficult. So I've always had this burning desire to figure out what's the difference. Why is life so much easier for someone like my brother than for me? Because we grew up in the same family. So theoretically or technically we had the same foundation, and yet it turned out so differently for us.
So you had older brother or younger brother?
Yes, older. He's 8 years older than me, so always looked up to him, and he was very much like a free spirit and had so much belief in himself and in the world, and that of course he could do anything he put his mind to, and he proved that over and over. And there was one time when I was probably complaining about how unfair it felt. I did that quite a lot, unfortunately. And he said, "You know what, sister? The only difference between you and me is that I believe I could do anything." So I thought about that a lot, and I believed that he was right. I always believed that life was meant to be good. I just felt like the exception. I felt like life is supposed to be good, but I'm somehow broken that I cannot make my life good. And that contributed a lot to the way I looked at my life. I felt sorry for myself a lot. So, victim mentality and beating myself up for not being good enough was a big part of growing up and into adulthood as well.
Do you recall like around like what age, like, were you in like middle school, high school? How,
I
when did it start?
I don't actually ever remember anything different from that. Uh, of course, there were good times as well, but I don't actually remember like, oh, when I was a little kid, I was so happy and cheerful. I think I was always sort of a little bit preoccupied or worried about things, and but I do remember as a teenager, I had a pretty tough time. And I mean, it's always difficult to be a teenager, but I I might have suffered a little bit more because of my whole disposition towards life, that the whole feeling sorry for myself didn't help at all. I have to admit. Um, but I think the worst of it was about 8 years ago. I think it felt like sitting at the bottom of a deep, dark emotional hole. And I had days where I felt like just wanting to claw my skin off because I couldn't stand being in my body. And when I went to bed at night, I wished I didn't have to wake up in the morning. So those were the darkest times. But and then sort of in between there were ups and downs for, yeah, as long as I can remember, really.
I don't know. So first of all, let me say something that um everyone's adversity is different. So
Mm,
one, I would never compare my adversity to another's. And then, there's no worst, better in
yeah.
when it comes to the adversity, because these are the feelings and emotions that we endured, and then your adversity is as greater than my adversity. And it's just like human beings, like, no, I
Mm,
more and more I interview people for my show, I just unfortunately start to think that adversity is a universal language. And no matter where you are in the world, like I was in Japan when I was going through that adversity, and you are in Denmark.
mm,
And
yeah.
then, I think um, everyone, regardless of social status and culture, country, race, think as a human being, like we have those moments that we
Mm,
feel like worthless, and then
yeah.
depressed. And how did it affect your life when you were in this kind of victim mentality and then like depressed, like how was your day-to-day life?
Oh God, I struggle just to get through the day sometimes, just because I have two kids and they were quite young when I was at my worst. Oh, and that was the worst part about it as well, because when I was stressed, I was sort of short tempered with them sometimes. If they wanted to do something, I was like, no, we can't do that because I don't have time. I can't face it. So that was kind of tough, but it helped a little. I think that I was always able to express to them what was going on. I made sure to tell them that this is me. I'm feeling difficult. I'm feeling bad inside. I don't have the energy. I wish I did. It's not your fault. But today we can't do finger painting all over the living room, because that just felt like, oh God. And then all the cleaning and I simply couldn't face it some days. And I think that was probably the worst part, that my kids had to go through that with me. So
So I don't know the situation when you were growing up in Denmark, but
mhm.
my experience is that when I was in Japan and then going through this sexual abuse and domestic violence, and then I just felt really crazy, alone, no idea
Yes.
what was going on because there was no aid in terms of mental health counseling
Mm,
or such a stigma. And I didn't even know that I was sexually abused. I did not even know I had
no.
PTSD until I was 21, 22. When you are in
Yeah.
the middle of mass, you just don't have the right language. How
Mm.
how did people around you, when you maybe shared, like react, or did they educate you what was going on?
That's actually a really good question. And I think you're right that we tend to, while we're in it, especially as children, we don't know that it's supposed to be different. We don't know anything else. And the time was different as well. So I wasn't aware that things were that bad. And I guess sometimes they weren't. It was this feeling of being different and weird and alone. But I always thought that, my family didn't have visible issues. There was no drinking, there was no violence, there was, my dad was away a lot, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and she was very sort of worried and anxious all the time. Later, she was diagnosed with anxiety, but at the time, people just thought that she was a little high-strung and a little bit sort of. So if you were looking at our family, you wouldn't probably have spotted that there was anything off. It was kind of subtle dysfunctions that took me a long time to actually realize, because I was telling myself that I had a great childhood, I was lucky, and that I shouldn't be having any issues. So again, I turned it back to myself, that it had to be me that was something wrong with. But as I've grown up, and look back, I realized that my mom, with her anxiety, and my dad away all the time, she and I got pretty close, and she shared a lot of her worries with me, which I was probably too young to deal with. And my brother, he was such a free spirit, and so he was out with friends all the time. So a lot of the time it was me and my mom, and I think I grew up feeling kind of responsible for her. But not like sometimes you hear about kids growing up with alcoholic parents, where they actually physically have to take care of them. It wasn't like that, so no one noticed, and I wasn't aware. People just thought that I was a nice, quiet girl. I was probably very easy on my teachers most of the time, because I wasn't making a big fuss. They just thought that I had, low self-esteem, and I was a bit shy, and that was nothing they could do about that. So yeah, there's nothing really it wasn't spoken about.
Yeah, it's just as we grow, and especially after, the pandemic, I feel everybody went through the depression and isolation, and
Mm,
then
mm,
now finally we are starting to talk a little bit less stigma about mental health.
mm,
Like what you said, especially when outside, like looking from objective view, your family doesn't seem like having any problems. And especially when it comes to the depression or stress, like people just don't see it, and then you
mm.
hide it because to work, go to work, whatever. So
Yeah,
I would say, those masking and the pressure to be okay makes it worse than it
yeah.
is.
Yes, yes, I agree that having to pretend to be normal and smile and be happy, that was hard work for most of the time. And I like to think that, as you say, that maybe some good has come from the pandemic. And I think in general we are moving towards better times for our kids, because so many of us in our generation, we are starting to, look inwards and deal with these things that come up. And I believe that the more we do that, the more we will be able to firstly see it in our kids if they are struggling. And then we will have better tools to deal with it than our parents did, because they weren't taught about mental health issues. And so they were doing the best they could. I totally believe that. So I do think we are moving towards a future where there will be less stigma because there's more awareness. I hope so, at least.
Yes, and especially some of the countries that say Japan, like we just started to talk about like Me Too movement, or
Mm,
like some of the Middle Eastern country where women's rights are not really there, or maybe some of the countries in Africa, like where men are like so powerful and dominant.
yeah.
So then that comes extra, stress and then social pressure. How is it in Denmark? Do you have any gender inequality issues?
I think we are very fortunate in Denmark in many ways, because we have had a couple of waves of the Me Too movement, and we don't have equal pay, and there are still a lot of things to work on. But and Denmark's always been seen as quite liberated, I think, and free when it comes to gender. And I think we were the first country to um, where, same-sex marriages, not in church, I think that was the Netherlands, but to be registered as legal partners. I think we were the first to do that. So in that sense, we are open-minded, I think. And we're probably also doing reasonably well when it comes to mental health, and there are resources available to some degree, at least. But still, it is an invisible illness in a way. So, yeah, the tricky part is always to see that it's there, or to admit that it's there, and then figure out how to get some help. But I think we're fortunate in many ways here.
And I'm curious, in Denmark, do you have access to like therapist, free care?
Not free. We can, if we go to our doctor, they will, give us a referral, and then we have to pay some of it, but we do get help, which is which is very nice. And my daughter has an Asperger's diagnosis that she got a couple of years ago, just before she turned 17, and that was free. for her, she was her whole diagnosis process. That was actually her school that finally sort of said, okay, we need someone to look at this, because I was in communication with the school, and she was showing signs of stress. Was my first thought about it. And also, I don't know if you're familiar with the term highly sensitive people, but that's how I feel, and I thought that counted for her as well, but it wasn't quite the same. And then she started showing signs of social anxiety, and then the school had a counselor they could call in to do an assessment, and he said, I think we need this checked out. So he referred her to the diagnosis process, and then she went through the system and got her diagnosis, and all that was for free, which is probably a big thing for compared to many other countries.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So, Trina, thank you so much for sharing your adversity. I just want to let you know there are 2 points in my life, uh, two times I have clearly, like, I clearly remember. Like, one, I wrote on my book, A Gift from Adversity, because there was a man when I was volunteering disabled people camp, where I was feeding this man who was born wheelchair bound, and then I
Mm.
was feeding him and having conversation, and then it took him a very long time, but he told me that last month my mom died, and then he it was very hard for him, and the next thing he said, it was my fault, and that took
Oh.
like 15 minutes, and it really broke my heart. And but in a way that basically realized that um, this was when I was 17, and when I went through these adversities, I had so much like puzzles in my life that I had no idea what was going on. But at the same time, I swore myself, since I have 5 senses and I can see and smell, move, I would never complain until I really try
Mm.
to fail. So that's been my philosophy. And then it's not in my book, but it was actually a boyfriend when I was 19 that he told me I'm so negative. I'm like really,
Mm.
the way that I look the world is half the cup is half the cup of water is not enough. And then he's like, Juri, you have to change your mentality. Even if you have half cup of water, you should be very grateful and humble. And if you don't take that positive approach, everything would um, look really, really bad for us. And then he was very right. And then I was really, because of the abuse and everything, I didn't even have much help to
Mm.
figure out what was going on. But despite that, he really cared about me, and then he really pointed that I'm looking, everything is against me, and everything is awful.
Yeah.
So at some point, somebody had said that, or experienced that, and then I kind of shifted. So let's talk about the tools that you use to overcome the stress and then depression. I like this part of the question because everybody that I interviewed so far have
Mm-hmm.
different opinions and different tools that they used. And what I like about doing this podcast is that everyone from any part of the world who had experienced adversity, they had struggled just like me, and
Mm.
they had tried many modality to overcome these adversities. And I
Yeah.
really appreciate that, because typically when people do not go through adversity, they will just say, "Oh, just a therapist," and sometimes it's called the therapist, and sometimes even if you get the therapist, you don't know if that person connect can connect with you. So
Mm.
what were the tools that you used to overcome this depression and stress?
Yeah. Yes. I think this is a good part as well. Um, and fortunately, this is where I'm spending my time now, because even talking about the worst times, I can even feel how that's making me thoughtful and quiet, and it's not bringing me down as such, but it's difficult to think that that was my reality for so long, now that I know what life can be like. And for me, I wish there was one like moment where everything just made sense, like a flash of lightning. Some people seem to have these stories where they woke up one morning and they just knew they had to change, or you had a boyfriend who pointed it out so clearly to you. um, I think if I have to point to one thing that changed a lot for me, was when I finally gave up on all the struggle. Because, as you said, we try everything to feel better once we realize that there's something more out there, that we do need to change. So I was reading all the self-help books, and I also saw therapists and psychologists, and most of them I didn't really connect with. Some helped a little bit, but that's a long time ago that I kind of stopped trying that. So it was self-help books, and meditation techniques, and going for long walks in nature, and breathing exercises, journaling, and all these things. And sometimes when I found a book, I was like, oh yes, yes, this is good, this is good. So I was all in. I was trying this technique and really holding on the best I could. And then it only lasted so long, and then I sort of fell back into my hole. So at some point, oh yes, and then there was I read a book, I don't remember the title, but I came to a statement that said happiness is a choice. And I was like, seriously, if it was that easy, we would all just choose to be happy. I was like, I actually got kind of angry, and I wanted to throw the book out the window. But I knew there was something to it, so I kept coming back to it. But at the time, it was just too difficult. So it wasn't until I quit all that chasing things externally. I was trying to live up to this advice and to this technique and to this list of things to do if you want to be spiritual or enlightened. So for a while, I was kind of sulking, because I had done everything. I did everything all the books said, and it wasn't working. So I felt kind of sorry for myself. And then I got annoyed and frustrated enough to quit that chase. And by doing that, that actually freed up some energy and some space, I guess, internally, because it was like returning to myself. Because I was out of options, I had tried this way and that way and that way and that way. I had tried everything and none of it worked. So the only thing left that I hadn't tried was to, return and feel what's right for me. What do I actually want to do? So that was completely new and foreign to me. But that's what shifted things.
So is there any other tools that you used? You kind of mentioned like a breathing stuff too, but is there anything that you can share with with our audience about the tools a little bit more?
Well, after this giving up the struggle part, that helped a lot in itself. But the next step I took was, because the new space that had opened up, the new outlook I had on life and myself, that allowed me to look back and see that all these sides of myself that had made it so hard for me to fit in to the real world, and to have a normal job and these things, that was the highly sensitive part of me, that I always picked up on other people's emotions more easily. And I was aware of my surroundings to a degree that was overwhelming, so I was easily tired. But when I started looking at things differently, I noticed how there's gifts in that as well. And that was such an eye opener, that I was like, huh, I always thought that this part of me was the biggest liability, that this was the reason that my life was hard. But realizing that it was also actually some of my best qualities. It was what made me have this understanding of other people and sense of what was going on, and being able to connect the dots and understand why they were reacting the way they were. Then I started looking at, what else could I have been looking at as a problem that might actually turn out to be a gift? So that was probably, and is still, my most favorite tool, because that's where life becomes fun. And I mean, like you have written your book, and now you're doing this podcast. So you are helping a lot of people by sharing not just the stories of your guests, but people listening, understanding, oh my God, I'm not alone in this, and there is a way out. And maybe you wouldn't have gotten here without your story, and I certainly wouldn't have gotten here without my story. So yes, flipping things around and looking for the gifts, that has been my favorite tool, absolutely.
Yes, and I would say, Trina, like when we were talking about generation and the generational, like say, um, my generation in Japan, absolutely back in '80s, we had no mental health talk, nothing
Mm.
therapy, like no understanding. But our generation, like my kid generation, there's mental health, guidance counselor, there's mental health talked about. Um, how do you think it's shifting, and how do you think it's helping for this depression, stress, and all this rate
Mhm.
puzzle?
I don't think it's shifting fast enough, not as fast as I would like it to, but I think shifts are happening. And as I said, that there's people like you and I and a lot of others who've been through these things ourselves, who are now more aware as parents, and that will help the next generations grow up more whole, I believe, and more healthy, because they're able to speak about it. And I think that's maybe the biggest part we can play as individuals, that is to be open about it and speak up and say, hey, I've suffered from stress and depression, but I got through it. To give this hope, and by being vulnerable and by being ourselves, we create a space where it's safe for others to admit if there's something that doesn't feel good in their life. And also, I think sometimes there's talk about that there are so many more kids now with various diagnoses mm, that there didn't used to be. And I think that's because society puts more pressure on our kids today than when we grew up. I mean, social media and all that, growing up with that alone, I think could give most people anxiety and a feeling of, comparing ourselves and stress and stuff. But I actually think that some of these kids that are born with various sort of neurodivergent personalities or whatever, that they are going to be front runners in changing society, because a lot of us, we have been people pleasers and we have been doing our best to fit in and all that. But some of these kids, they cannot be wrangled into those little boxes that we're expected to fit into. So by being themselves, and us as parents supporting them in being themselves, society will simply have to change, because at some point there won't be anyone left to fit into those worker bee boxes that they would kind of like us to be,
Yeah,
wouldn't they?
and I totally agree with you. And then I feel like when it's open cut, like we know how to put ointment or band-aid, or when you have
Mm-hmm.
fever, we know how to treat like Tylenol, like some fever reduce medication. But when it
Yeah.
comes to emotional injury and mental health issues that we don't know, we are not equipped enough, we don't have way too much tools. So I have this chart of coping skills, like anything, take take a nap, video,
Mm-hmm.
breathing, yoga. And then I think I have it on my cabinet that one of the clinician gave um, But I like it because it's almost like, okay, as a parent especially, like you are equipped and prepared to take care of your children when they get
Hmm.
sick. But then
Yes.
when people or children also get mentally sick and then mentally like challenged, like, you know, mental health, we
Mm.
just are not equipped because there's not so much talk about it.
Yes. But I think we are moving in the right direction, at least, even though there's still a lot of work to be done. But you're right. It would be really great, wouldn't it, if we had like the first aid kit, and then we had the toolbox for emotional emergencies.
Yes.
Where, yeah, yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
my daughter said, "Mama, I feel nervous." She's 5 years old, and her
Oh,
guidance counselor told her, "So breathe one, like so." She went up, like, just tracing the thumb, and it goes,
mhm.
like, breathe in and breathe out.
Yeah.
So she did it 5 times, and then it was really cute. And then she showed me how to do that breathing technique using the fingers. And
Mm,
those are the things, that tools that even 5 years old can learn to basically shift the brain, you know, chemicals
yeah.
that I feel like we can't get out of it. In fact, one of the guests who suffered with um, substance abuse, that when his heart stopped, and then when he
Mm,
went to halfway like recovery home, then he learned so much techniques to not get panic attack or to not rely on the substance, where
yeah.
now he start to feel the panic attack, he can use all these tools that he learned and come out of it in like 10 minutes instead of like a month, 3 months, a year of depression. So I think
Yes.
it really is important that we all know these skills.
Absolutely. And I was talking to a guest on my podcast from Italy, and she shared that her son, who's I think 6 or 8 years old, he is learning empathy in school. Isn't that amazing? They had that as a theme, learning about understanding how other people are feeling, and how to interact in a kind way. I mean, it's a little bit sad maybe that it has to be taught, but I think it's so good that there's focus on how important it is
I
to
think,
learn these skills. Mm.
yes, and I think, we as a human being, like, we are social animals, and then we really know how to take care of ourselves and each others. But when we are given a proper terms in words and logics, what we are doing and intentionally doing it, I think it makes it more powerful and meaningful, and it's
Mhm.
validate, the actions that you're talking about, like empathy. We do that, but we just don't know. Like, no, we
Mhm.
are intentionally empathetic about the situation.
Yeah. And I think sometimes I think you're right that that it's built into us, that it's natural for us to have these, to be empathetic and to be kind to each other, and we are social. But I think sometimes our society creates an environment where it's difficult to keep these skills alive. Maybe some grow up, learning to shut those sides down, especially if they're too sensitive, because then it just becomes annoying for parents and teachers if you're always fussy because you sense what's going on for everybody. um, so yeah, I hope we can create an environment and a future where there's space again for it to be a natural human trait.
Yes, absolutely. Well, Trina, I want to shift to our last question, which is a gift that came from adversity. So, how do you say a gift that came from your adversity?
Oh, I mean, just experiencing the difference from waking up and feeling, happy to be alive. Sometimes I'm like, I love getting to wake up and have another day. So that is probably the biggest gift. How, yes, the huge difference. And also the understanding I have gotten along the way, because as I started out telling you, that I have always had this question about what makes life seem easier for some people than others. And on my way through all these years of stress and depression, and all the self-help books I read, and all the spiritual teachings I digested, I have gotten a deeper understanding of what it means to be human, and what makes us who we are, and what makes us react the way we do. So it has really deepened my understanding and my sort of sense of the overall picture and how to connect the dots. And sometimes I say that if it was that decade or even a lifetime of stress and depression, that was what it took to teach me, if you like, what I needed to know to get to here, I would do it all over again in a heartbeat if I had to, because it has been so worth it for me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that beautiful answer. Um, why we are closing our podcast interview, but I would like Trine to have the last word for our audience. So, what is your last word? And also, after you do the English version, if you can do it in your language, Danish, that would be awesome.
Okay, thank you. Well, I really want people to know that if I can do this, everybody can. And that's my work today, helping people to find this foundation. I call it Happy and Aligned, and I have a 5-day event soon where, because when we have this stability in ourselves, this trust in life, that life is good, and that we can turn everything around to be a part of who we're meant to be, then life can't really get to us. So very short Danish. Tilværelsen er på vores side. Livet er ment til at være godt, og vi er her for at nyde det. So,
That was beautiful. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you coming to the podcast today at Gift University. And thank you so much for sharing not only your life story, but the tools and the gift that came from it.
thank you so much for creating this space where it felt safe to share. Thank you for a very nice conversation.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everyone for listening to A Gift from University. I have wonderful guests coming in April and in May, so stay tuned. Good night.